education rounds. I am Dr. Bilgic, Education Sciences and Pediatrics at Merit. And Merit program is an education services program in the Faculty of Health Sciences with a vision to grow a community of scientists and clinicians to advance health professions education through research and applied science. And as a part of this vision, the Merit has created a visiting professorship that invites prominent scholars with expertise relevant to health professions education to engage in a part-time, year-long residency at Merit. And the goal of this professorship is to build a particular knowledge base, skill set, or capacity in the Merit scientists and community. And we're excited to be hosting Dr. Cheryl Poth, who's here, for a series of visits to McMaster over the course of 2 years. Her portfolio really will bring a diversity of quantitative and qualitative methodology expertise in acquiring improved competence in mixed methodology research. Now, you might remember Dr. Poth as she introduced us to mixed methods as a round speaker in May. And today she will further guide us in our journey in learning about mixed methods. And before I say a little bit more about Dr. Poth, I would like to make a last acknowledgement. And today's education round is virtual, and many of us in this event are connected by the lens on which we work. And so I take this time to recognize that McMaster is on the traditional territory shared between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy during the Anishinaabe Nations, which was acknowledged in the dish with one spoon, wampum belt. That wampum represents the symbolism of a dish to represent the territory, and one spoon to represent that the people are to share the resources of the land and only take what they need. Now, before leaving the stage to our esteemed visiting professor, I will provide a very brief introduction, like I said. So today's title is What Distinguishes a Credible Mixed Method Study from Other Research Approaches. And Dr. Cheryl Poth is a professor in the Center for Research and Applied Measurement and Evaluation at the University of Alberta, and was a founding board member and president of the Mixed Methods International Research Association. With increased interest among researchers in understanding and using mixed methods research, Dr. Poth will examine current conceptualizations of key quality criteria associated with mixed methods research, discuss some emerging practices, and highlight illustrative health research examples. And during the rounds, for those joining over Zoom, feel free to use the chat for comments and questions. And we will have a Q&A period at the end, and so you can ask your questions during that time using the hand raising function as well. And for those joining in person, you can simply ask your questions at the end or during the presentation. And so without further ado, please go ahead. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be here in person. As you know, I joined you in May, and it was nice to start to get to know folks. Today we had some vibrant conversations about different things, including about what it means to do mixed methods. And the reason why I actually changed the title on you is because I talk about might as being, okay, like we don't actually have firm yet common understanding about what this is. And so I wanted it to be tentative, but a little assertive at the same time. Or maybe it's more of a challenge as well about, let's talk about how might literally we as a community in the health education professions begin to, as a community, build understanding about what mixed methods might look like in this particular area. And so similar to what you talked about is I had also was looking for how best to. Oh, there we go. Is I had also, because I had learned about, it was lovely to hear you talk about the dish and one spoon agreement, because I hadn't read about that before, and I did a little of my own research. But I really am privileged to gather here today with you to learn and land as a guest and recognize our responsibilities in our disciplines and in our methods that we use to respect, honor, and give thanks to those who have come before us. So I wanted to situate the gaps in mixed methods. And today, some of the conversations I've had with wonderful Merit scientists is we realize that we may not be as far as maybe we think we should be in kind of our practices and in our understandings. And so I wanted to contextualize where we're at. There has been an exploding use, and we can all define exploding in different ways, but maybe a higher prevalence and in the past 5 years, and each year has kind of been increasing. We're seeing, and not necessarily that it's a new method, it's just a method that's now being labeled. We're seeing increased use of it in titles and in abstracts. And we talked a little bit today about, do we need to include it in a title? And I would say maybe it's easier to find when we're searching than to have it. And so, and I think we can say that it recognizes its potential, and I'm mindful when I talk about potential. And I think there really is an expanding context where it's being used. So it's being used not just in our clinical practice, but now in our education studies with different populations. We're seeing this potential sometimes in small incident populations, where sometimes perhaps it's been challenging to be able to make our research known to our different audiences. Absolutely, there are rapidly evolving practices in terms of when we look at research that's published 5 or 10 years ago, we sometimes look for our current practices in them, and they simply don't exist. But there has been certainly limited guidance available in some practice areas. So we're going to talk about what practice areas those are, and I think in particular, to kind of give you a foreshadow, that there is some limited guidance available in the actual integration piece, which, given how we define mixed methods as requiring integration, the irony is not lost on me that before recently we haven't really talked about as much about the evidence of integration or about the practices that help us to actually develop integration evidence. There certainly have been increased access to learning opportunities than there was 5 years ago. I launched our first mixed methods course on the U of A campus 12 years ago now, and it still fills within the first 24 hours or 36 hours, and it draws from across the campus. So there certainly is but I'm a first generation instructor of mixed methods. I'm very proud that I have who was in my first class is now teaching on the University of Manitoba campus. And so there is now other people who are, but the way that I teach mixed methods has vastly changed in terms of I actually start with integration and everything expands from that, which is just an interesting kind of way. So we've been trying to figure out in the mixed methods community, how do we talk and how do we expand the capacity of instructors for those kinds of courses. But we do see that there's not as much availability for training beyond introductory. And about mixed method researchers talk about, well, I need more, they're using the words advanced, or I kind of think about it when I get started, or maybe on demand help as I get into a project. I can write up a proposal, but actually, how do I find useful training opportunities that will help me when I get into the integration piece? There are widely differing expectations for publication, and I think that often depends on the journal history of publishing mixed methods, availability of peer reviewers, also perhaps even the orientation of editors and the history of the journal. But we're certainly seeing mixed methods published in places that perhaps we hadn't seen it before. So a wee bit about my own mixed methods roles, the Mixed Methods International Research Association and my affiliation there. We just celebrated our 10th anniversary, and this was really was born out of a health conference that was focused on mixed methods, and we decided that we needed an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary association, and so that's where that was. We had another global conference happening in the summer, and that's usually every 2 years, and then regional conferences on the year. I recently played the role as editor of a handbook in mixed methods. This is the first handbook from Sage in mixed methods. It kind of follows the first one was over, I guess 15 years ago, and then the last one was about 10 years ago. So this was focused on design this time, because I really do think this is where the explosion is going to happen. And this diagram, it just kind of talks about where the 37 chapters of the handbook, kind of go. It's kind of a little bit of a navigation. So in the first one, we're talking about the dilemmas and opportunities for mixed methods. In the second section, we're talking about mixed methods as a craft and the messiness of mixed methods, and talking about different elements that have come about. In the first section, we actually had folks go back who have been in the community and talking about how the designs have evolved and not evolved in the past 20 years. And then in section 3, we're talking about some of the areas of where we see this great expansions of mixed methods. So everything from the intersections with other approaches that are known. In section 4, we talk a lot about integration with technology and how technology is helping us have new data sources, have new ways of integrating and how to represent our data. And in the 5th section, we talk about navigating research cultures and how research cultures influence design and demonstrating geographical diversity, global geographical diversity, because much of the mixed method literature has come from, has been focused on North America and has been focused on Europe. And so how do we bring in the other parts of the world in terms of contributing in this way? And then our final one is really exploring the design possibilities and challenges. And in that section, we have everything from team-based work to collaborative work to, you know, how do we use existing data and secondary data, and then hopefully just kind of launching literally about where the field's going to go next. I've been involved as an associate editor of the Journal of Mixed Methods Research for the better part of a decade. I've done several special issues, and I talk about special issues as bringing together, and people will kind of read kind of the collection if it's done in different disciplines. So I've done some work in kind of qualitative and in program evaluation and in a couple of other different fields at different times. The Innovations of Mixed Methods book really came out of questions that I was hearing in the conferences and in the workshops I was doing around the world, where people were talking about, my design doesn't fit. My study doesn't fit one of these designs that are very well established. And I thought we needed to pay more attention to the sources of complexity in our designs. And I'm excited that I'm going to work on the next edition of that, which, you know, it's fascinating to kind of watch where our thinking has shifted in different ways. And so, so hopefully establishing a little bit about where I'm coming from, and health is certainly always interwoven into a lot of my work, because the places that we do health research are not straightforward, and they are complex, and they're interesting, and they involve lots of different sources of data. But let me just remind you a little bit about a few specialized terms before we go too far. Integration, just a quick reminder from our main discussion, is that integration is a central concept in mixed methods. It's actually a distinguishing characteristic. It involves, you know, combining in a study or a series of studies information from qualitative and quantitative data or perspectives. A mixed method design represents procedures for collecting, analyzing, integrating, and interpreting qualitative and quantitative research. A joint display is a term that has come. It's a table or a graph that presents a combination of the ways that we are combining qualitative and quantitative in different ways, and then meta inferences are the insights that emerge as we develop, and it's probably more about the outcomes of mixed methods. So if I use any of these terms kind of in the rest of the presentation, hopefully you'll be able to know what we're doing. So it's important to know that there's a long, if I can, long tradition of empirical reporting guidelines, and they're actually coming out of health. In this particular one, it was out of the UK. This has been highly cited, and I think part of it is it spells grams, so it's like an easy one to remember. And so there were 6 parts to this, that if you did mixed methods, this is what was expected. And some of these will be familiar, and maybe we can talk a little bit about where, you know, what some of the missing pieces are. But it talks about describing the justification for using mixed methods as opposed to another approach. It talks about describing the design in terms of purpose, priority, and sequence of methods. And we haven't talked too much recently about priority. The priority was meaning, are we prioritizing qualitative or quantitative? And that has kind of fallen a little bit out of favor. And part of that is, I think, simply practicality. We don't always know where we want to place our priority. Describing each method in terms of sampling, data collection, analysis, which we have, but I also think it's not just each method, or each strand of different kinds of qual or quant, but it's actually about integration. So what's the relationship of the samples when we're integrating? What's the relationship of the analysis or integration? So if you look at that list, there actually is very little description other than a number 4 about integration. And it is this idea about they wanted to know where integration has occurred, how it occurred, and who has participated in it. And that's interesting to me around the participation piece, which has kind of fallen a little bit out, but I think it's, I would like to see who's participated in kind of all of the mixed methods work. And then describe any limitation. I think that that's important, but it's also maybe the contribution of it. And then any insights gained from mixing or integrating. I think the word any is quite funny there, because it's like, isn't that the whole purpose of this, is to actually to have insights? So I alluded to a little bit of that in terms of that missing key integration evidence in the findings. So there's this leap, I think, between the data collection analysis and then the insights. And we still see a little bit of that, you know, kind of hiddenness that I think is going to happen in the next decade as we begin to be more explicit about how, why we are doing integration and what is kind of coming out of it. But that's certainly a foundation reading, if I can, there. So we're coming out of there, and then now there's calls, ongoing calls for comment. This was a recent in 2022, and the kind of key points out of this article are that quality indicators are influenced by the researcher context. So that's what the researcher is bringing in terms of their philosophy, their training, their disciplinary and methodological expertise. And I think that that's kind of interesting, so that, you know, it does matter in terms of who we are going into, and that maybe we should be making more explicit who we are in our mixed methods research. And that was a conversation that was lovely that we had today. And that quality needs to be considered within the study context. Okay, so within disciplinary traditions, within who our participants are, and perhaps our designs, and of course these are just examples. And that key distinguishing dimensions of reporting quality involves providing transparent, accurate, and comprehensive information of design and execution. So I can certainly get on board with that, that we need to be more explicit and more forthright about what we're doing, why we're doing, and how we're doing this. So that's, I think, a really lovely launch, you know, kind of into that need for that. So it was interesting that recently I was doing just a little bit of sleuthing again to see where are we at. And so I was on the Equator Network potential, and I think that there is some potential to contribute to mixed methods. If you look at, and so this is the website that has a comprehensive list of quality reporting criteria, and that the goal is to improve the reliability and value of published health literature by promoting transparent and accurate reporting. I can see a similarity to what the authors of the recent JNMR article did, and that it's organized by design. And what's interesting to me is that some of these were recently uploaded. And so there's actually a time, even though, like this one is from 2019, no, that's 2013. Sorry, I think I made an error there in my citation. Sorry, but I wanted to draw your attention because this the Levitt article has gotten a fair bit of visibility, at least in my area, and part of it is I want you to notice that it's the quality reporting standards for qualitative research as well as mixed methods research. So fascinating that there was no qualitative reporting standards before this, but by working on the mixed methods, then they also did the qualitative here. And this is done by APA, which is the American Psychological Association. So they're actually putting out standards for reporting for those two alongside, you know, the quantitative ones have been there for quite some time. So this is kind of seen in the psychological field as a real watershed moment in 2018 that this, and so like I said, it's gotten a fair bit of uptake. And then there's a new September health work that we were talking about, and so I actually put it here in that they're actually advancing systematic development of standards for mixed methods reporting in rehabilitation health sciences research. And so it's super interesting to me to see that this is coming out in these fields. And so my question is this isn't necessarily specific, but it's kind of neat to see it come out. But will these then happen in each discipline? And so where's the conversation, the methodological conversation happening across the health professions, if I can? And so I just think, but it's also interesting to see just how similar many of these are to this checklist that was published in the Journal of Mixed Methods in 2019. And it's like here's what should be there. But this is specific to what needs to be in a methodological contribution. So they're actually taking practices, which is great, and putting it into there. So I think it's really exciting, but I also wonder if it's, if we just need to actually have standards that we can refer to across the health professions. But it's cool to see that this is being uptaken by folks, and that it almost reminds me of like the translation of the methodological into kind of the practice. So that is exciting. So key practice contributions in 2019. What we've seen in the past 4 years now is this idea that title, that it refers to relevant and research, mixed methods research or literature, that there's a design figure, and that there is some sort of visual, kind of structure in order to represent the findings. So we talked about these things today as well. And so I am hopeful that we'll see more kind of uptake and more of these types of practices as we go along. So you might ask me then, so I will say that this list is a Cherylism. So sometimes I say, I try to be upfront about, you'll see much of this connected, but I've actually added a couple of things to this list, and I just wanted to kind of explain them. And then in a moment, I'm going to walk us through examples of these. So let me start with rationale for conducting a mixed method study. This would appear usually in an introduction, not necessarily in a methods anymore, or just in the methods. But it's this idea about justifying the need for integration and specifying what a mixed methods approach will bring to the research problem. And so this is a great opportunity here for talking about what in this problem has been done, perhaps qualitatively or quantitatively, or like what's the gap? What's the topical gap and the methodological gap is often what we've talked about. And then that, it kind of situates why we're doing mixed methods. And it's different because we do that in the introduction, not only in the methods. The guiding purpose, research questions or aims really does narrow now. So now you've identified the need for mixed methods, perhaps in your field and in that problem. And then now a purpose or research questions or aim, what it does is it serves as the bridge between your problem and now your choice of design. I'm not suggesting that this is linear when we're actually doing it. Sometimes we might start with the data logic and then work backwards in that. But this is what I'm talking about in an article, and I would argue much of this is relevant for a proposal as well. And so you want to formulate a purpose to focus the study and questions or aims that can only be addressed by integration. So if I read your purpose, or if I read your research question, and it's more qualitative or quantitative, I might say, why are you doing mixed methods? So what I hope we can do is work on a little bit. There's not a lot of great examples out there in literature of mixed methods questions. Sometimes we see aims, sometimes we see qual questions and quant questions, but I would argue if we can focus in on the research questions that need integration, a lot of other things will kind of fall into place. This is a little bit of a Cherylism. We've been talking more and more about the role of theory and philosophy in the study, and that's what's happening. I don't think we see this as much on any lists quite yet. We certainly see identifying theoretical frameworks, but I actually would like to see more about discussions about how theory relates to the integration. How is it informing maybe what you're studying, a problem, the angle that you're coming at, what questions you're asking, what data procedure decisions you're asking, and how you're coming to your interpretations. So I think I'm asking for a little bit more than what we often see in practice, but I think this is a conversation about where we're going, to be honest. But the visual and narrative design descriptions, I'm talking there about the where and how the data will be generated, analyzed, and integrated. So that would be your often a design diagram, and you can see the logic. And that has certainly become a very standard practice in the Journal of Mixed Methods. But as we saw today, when we looked at some of our health publications, that is still hit or miss, but whether or not we're seeing that. And design diagrams can be really helpful for being concise in when we're very limited by our word counts. And then this is one where ethical and rigorous procedures, we will often see rigorous procedures, but we don't often see ethical pieces. I recently published a paper with some colleagues at the US when we were studying what do folks recognize as ethical issues in mixed methods in a training program. And it's interesting because usually folks go back to, well, in qual we look at this and in quant we look at that. And I was like, okay, so we're not actually having discussions about what are the things we need to consider when we're doing mixed methods as well. You know, sometimes there is I talk about maybe sometimes we intensify the expectations on folks. So there might be some specific, you know, changes to maybe how we are maintaining confidentiality, how we're getting consent. Is it enough to get consent from your participants once at the beginning of your study? Or should we be reaffirming consent? And this is not a discussion that's only to mixed methods, but I think it allows us to have these conversations again about what some of our expectations are. I often get sent as an ad hoc on our ethics committee, you know, can you look at this mixed method, did you see things, you know, that we should be asking for in this, you know, because the way that sometimes our ethics boards is they're more like survey oriented or more qualitative oriented. And so often people are like, we don't quite know where the mixed methods fits, or if it's health research, we're used to seeing more protocols and we're not quite sure, you know, if everything is meeting what we would expect the standards. So I'd like to see, you know, more than just a disclosure that we applied for ethics and that we got, you know, the ability to move forward. I'd like to hear a little bit about how consent was achieved and what, you know, how are you, if you are trying to match or to link data, how are you doing that? What have you collected? So that's a little description about that. And rigorous is the idea about both qualitative and quantitative, as well as the rigorous procedures of integration. And then we're talking about representing integration in the findings. You know, do we have data displays? Do we, you know, do those data displays, you know, provide the bridge again between our findings and our interpretations? Are we able to see evidence of what we would expect to see for being able to establish validity in our interpretations? And then that's the idea about where we're going through in validation evidence. You know, are we identifying threats in the generation of our interpretations? And are we talking about how we're minimizing them? And then evidence of this, you know, what are we getting from mixed methods that is different than what we would get from qual or quant at this point? Let me pause here. This seems like a good, before we get into our examples, do folks in the room or online have questions about any of these before we go on? And I'll kind of demonstrate using a couple of published papers, and we'll talk about, you know, some examples and maybe places where we're not seeing the practices yet. Sure.
I think the way that, I mean, these are often presented is that it kind of needs to be a really thoughtful decision from the start that you're doing mixed methods. And I think that's fair, but are there ever any situations where you're in the middle of a study and you realize like, wow, it would be great to have this qualitative piece, and like, is there a way to kind of come into this partway through the research?
So that was certainly a very common entry point for folks to consider mixed methods, and I think it still is. But I do think it's also, if, you know, we always talk about almost idealized, and then we have to think about, you know, how we can be responsive, how we can be adaptive, how we can do all of those things, right? And so, sure, I don't think there's any doubt, but I think when you're then starting to think about that, then I think thinking through that, even at that point, would be helpful. Okay, now that I'm going to, you know, shift, or I'm going to pivot to more of a mixed method study. You know, I always think about where are my vulnerabilities, you know, a little bit up. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but I think it's being upfront. And I'm trying to kind of really reconceptualize limitations as, you know, we sometimes you know, how can we almost proactively address as many limitations as possible? And if you're going to do that, then let's not present the mixed method study like it was at the beginning, but let's actually talk about why and kind of how we came to that. So I've been talking a lot in actually all of my qual, my quant, and my mixed reporting about like being more authentic to actually what happened. And part of it is some of the discussions I have in workshops and in courses and in conferences where people are like, wow, you know, this is the study isn't happening. My study isn't happening as nicely as yours. It's like, oh no, it was nasty. You know, let me, you know, how do I actually build that in now to my reporting? And the way that I started doing it is writing books, which maybe isn't the best way of going about it, but at least it's beginning to get things out there, and I'm trying to also highlight papers that actually embrace the messiness and talk about that. And we talked a little bit about how do people know how to navigate messiness if we don't talk about it. I remember I have a great book called, when research goes off the rails, and it's like, oh, like if research hasn't gone off the rails for you, you're probably not doing it correctly. You're probably doing it more safe, and so how do we, it reminds me a little bit about, taking risks and changing things up in the middle and pivoting. Why aren't we actually embracing that if that's the better way of doing things? Why do we feel like we have to see through a project when we know it's not going to, have as whatever outcomes or have the impact or the influence on our participants if we just change things up a little bit? So I hope that was great, a great question. So I am all about always, my answer is convince me why you can't do something, as opposed to, doing those things. Anything else? It's quiet. All right, right now. All right, so I ended up actually going out of health, and part of it was because I wanted to show a little bit of an innovative as well way, and I was having troubles actually finding, but I've got one here in medical teacher, and I just want to be upfront with, these are both great publications, and I want to highlight the things that they've done really well. These are both quite recent ones, which is also important in terms of where we're looking at things. I thought the simulation-based medical education, I know that other people work in that in this area, so there were lots of reasons why I chose this. I also thought what they were doing was interesting, that they weren't just doing an empirical study, but they were trying to build as well. And then this happened to be a case study, which I know can be used quite nicely in the health professions as well, and so I thought this might stimulate a little bit of conversation as well in this. So I give you the first page so that if you, and the references, if you decide that you want to have a deeper look, or that all you can see is a little bit blurry, I apologize, but it is, I want us to think, rather than getting caught in the weeds, just a little bit higher level, and then if you want to look closer at things, we certainly can. So I wanted to start with the rationale, and these are actually quotes, and so I thought it was important to kind of highlight where it was. In the one in medical teacher, they talked about, we developed a category framework to assess the communication content of debriefings, which we have used to analyze possible relationships to participant learning outcomes. And so that developing piece was important, and then how they used it then to look at the possible relationships. And what's interesting then is then you see the guiding purpose, questions or aims, and then it says the aim of the present study was to examine the contents of the communication between the debriefers, so that's those relationships, and then to determine any correlations with participant learning success. So what you can see here is that there is a relationship between the purpose and the aim and the rationale. And what they're saying here is that we needed to do it this way in order to be able to kind of focus in on this question. And so again, it's this idea that I see this as being a little bit aligned. And then we're looking for alignment among our ideas. And it's that idea about cohesiveness. If we look at the case study, this case study, they happen to identify the design in their rationale. And it was for detailed exploration of this unique program. And then what you'll see here then is that the questions led and they actually give a question. So this was just a different approach. This is the AIM approach. This is a research question. You don't need both, but it's when you think about what you're trying to do is to focus it, is it talks about to what extent do the qualitative results from the participants' experiences confirm the measurement data on participants' knowledge and technology. You know, if I was to say, I'd probably prefer to see, confirm is almost leading, isn't it? To just say we're looking for them to go together. I'd probably rather see relate or compare and contrast, but that's okay. They put their feet down in that, and it aligns with the detailed exploration. And now they're actually focusing. We're not just exploration, but we're actually looking for kind of this way of doing it. So if you think about a study that maybe you're thinking about, let's say maybe you have a qual or a quant study, and you're thinking about how I could build onto it, or I could reframe it as a mixed method study. Think about why we need mixed methods. In the May rounds, I talked a little bit about some of the purposes, and there's everything from explanation to exploration to triangulation to correlations to corroborations. And so why do you need the mixed methods? Why do you need both? And if you don't have an integration idea, then perhaps you should do it either qualitative or quantitative. And so I should have explained that I kind of kept I think this is orange, kind of to the medical education article, and where the purple blue one I used for the case study, just to remind. Any questions on here? They're quite different, and you can see how there's no one way of doing it, but what I hope is that is we think about what and maybe this is a great way for me to think about it, is that there's different practices that can get to the same outcomes, but that you're really just trying to kind of do that as well. So how do they define the role of theory and philosophy in the study? Well, in their literature review, these authors talking about debriefing is considered a social practice. When, because it's a social practice, it means that they're involved and they have, their description of behaviors, they have a citation from their literature in which they are basing it on. Then they identify, as I know is well used in some professional health teaching and or education, that we've got the Kirkpatrick model, and so it guided the participant evaluation data, and in particular, they identified how they were mapping onto this model. In the case study, they were talking about the TPAC, which stands for Technology Pedagogical Content Knowledge. And again, we don't actually need to know anything about these models or theories, but we're looking for how they used it in order to collect data. And so in this one, that they really used it to talk about the data, and then they come back to it again in the interpretations. And in this one, they're talking about it as being that it's arguing it, and the components of this model not only served as the guiding constituents for the professional development program, but also as a theoretical lens that guided the data analysis of the study. And so what was interesting is that these authors also put together what I would call a conceptual framework figure in order to just represent where these different aspects of this model kind of fit into these different places and help them in their data collection and then in their into their analysis. Neither one of them talked about philosophy or about research or positionality. So I just kind of point that out as well, that that's something that I think we can work on in our practices. So let's now talk about how they differed in terms of the visual and narrative design. So what's interesting is they talked about performing a prospective sequential exploratory mixed method study. Now, I put a little, the asterisk is my own, and the reason is that you have to be careful. Like Cresswell actually doesn't talk about this particular design, but perspective is very much used in kind of health in terms of looking for the outcomes. But you want to be careful that maybe it's a perspective, informed by, and so you want to be careful about how you're citing things. And then they talked about first we did this, next we did this, and it was a very effective way of being able to do it. But I thought it was really missing is that if they had just had a figure, then you could have done much of this in a figure and talked more about the two phases in a little bit more space saving in that. And so what the case study did is they talked about a convergent mixed methods research case study. And it talked about the qualitative work concurrent and not dependent on results of each other. You can very much see that they were independent and that this is where the integration started to come from. You can't see some of the words I know, but actually what they have is they do have some of the details. So this becomes not just a design diagram, but actually a procedural diagram. And I even wanted to point out they were so efficient with space here that they even put a little timeline. And so this is actually a timeline on here that you can see in the article that talks about, so you can see when things happened, how long things took. And again, even this morning we talked about unpacking a little bit about what these circles were. And this author has tended to do a little bit of that.
Just note, I can't see if the timeline is a generic timeline or saying it's that the two concurrent data collection is happening in the same time course.
Yes.
Because this kind of educational intervention is dynamic, it will change over time. I think that's, might wonder if that's best practice or if we should all be encouraged to think that way.
Sure, but or you could have had it on this side, and you could have demonstrated, you know, maybe where some of the different things happened. And so again, I don't think this is best practice or anything, but I think it's an interesting way of almost providing a variance or showing the variations of how figures can be used. And if it's important to demonstrate timing, in some studies it is, in some studies it's less. I mean, one of the things that I appreciate about this is they're actually showing, like, this is a whole year, you know, and I think what that does is it begins to unpack the feasibility of, and actually how long sometimes such studies take. And so I think that that's important. I mean, it would also be interesting, depending on what you were doing here, if you did, you know, if you could actually demonstrate, you know, if you had published anything. So this actually could be more of a, you could make this also be more of a, here's where we are in our program of research. So this could be one step up, and you could actually nest your study in here, and you could just call it that in an introduction. If that was important in terms of where does this particular paper even fit, and without putting it in words, and you can even put your other publications kind of listed, you know, here are your citations, so that somebody could see kind of how you've been building this and outcomes. So I think, you know, visuals can be just very, very effective and do many things. They just can't do everything. And so you have to think about, what does my reader need to know? And I can't help but think at the beginning, it's good to know if this is a standalone or part of a larger program of research. I don't think we always make that as a parent. And then I also think it's important to know, you know, where certain things happen. Not a perfect diagram by any, but a diagram is somewhat helpful, and I could really see where this one could really help us in terms of saving space, even on that. And so when we think about this, I put them together because there wasn't a whole lot of evidence, but I thought it was really interesting to see how much space in a very short medical education article was actually given to talking about ethics. It was a bit of a rarity for me to see, and I was very excited actually. So there was lots of my points are just kind of showing, and it's actually just talking about it. Some of this information was at the end of the article, don't get me wrong. Some of it was in it, but they certainly talked about after obtaining written informed consent for the participants. So it was really nice to see that that's, you know, one way that we were doing it. They talked about how it was stored, and that you know, who was guiding this work. This was obviously out of Europe. And then it did have information which I thought was important about coding, statistical analysis, and intercoder agreement, which again, we don't always see. I thought it was fascinating that there was nothing, not even that we had applied for ethics, which I think is important to declare, and a little bit about how, you know, did these teachers consent, or, you know, was it one of the times where they had the data and they went back, and then talked about it being secondary analysis. I don't know. I think it's important to know under what conditions data was collected. And then, but a nice description about the threats and validation strategies, included information about how the individual interviews and group discussions were undertaken, what instruments were used, that it was transcribed verbatim, that there was coding, member checking, as well as, which was nice to see, a mixed sampling. They had a match sample, which means that they used for the qualitative and the quantitative, it was the same people. And then they had the use of a joint display as well. And they talked about the use of the joint display was also to help guide the analysis as well as so just got a couple more to kind of finish us up. So there was no mention of integration in the medical teacher, and it talked about that the analysis showed 5 categories with significant correlations with outcome measures. That was, kind of the claim. And then they did go through those 5, and that's how they organized those 5. So that was, they organized it by the meta inferences, but they didn't actually disclose that it wasn't just the analysis, but it was actually the integration did this as well. I know you can't see a whole lot of this, but this is a joint display, just not done in table form. And I thought it was nice to actually show you that there's lots of different ways of doing this. And that, we can argue how easy that is to read when, they were trying to make it as kind of easy as possible. But they did talk about how some of the big ideas that came out of it. And they were talking about the outer ring as being confirmation of the qualitative and quantitative results. And then, kind of they walk the reader in through. And that this is kind of like their meta-analysis is the darkest part. So that's where they want you to focus the attention. So I thought it was kind of an interesting idea. I'm not sure it was as as readable as perhaps, but it's certainly an innovative way of presenting things. And then this is the evidence of the value add we demonstrated here, and that the present study that debriefs communicate as much as participants. And when they first set up study, they were talking about the assumption is that debriefers who are leading the debrief talk less. And so that's what they were kind of making that claim. And that this was their so what, or the implications was aligned with the purpose that was focused on assessing the communication content of debriefings. So they delivered the purpose of what they set out to do. And so that can give us some evidence of cohesion across the study. And then overall, that they were talking of the value added was that it allowed them to kind of meet what they wanted to do with their participants, and that they claimed that it did result in a better understanding, and that they're talking about that it was aligned with the purpose focused on more detailed exploration. And then neither one of these are, I say I don't think I've actually come across yet an article that kind of meets everything, but it just shows where some articles, are aligned with some of the current practices more than others. It also shows some of the variability that we can get across different articles as well. But I want to highlight that there's some things that can get in the way of sometimes understanding. And so I think it's helpful to talk about this, that we should be extensively using headings and subheadings, and that there are some subheadings that in mixed methods can be helpful. So for example, subheading of integration within methods allows me to quickly see that somebody has actually doing something in integration. And so I think it's just important. Of course, we sometimes have to follow headings that are required by the journal or help with a typical flow. But I think there's often some ways of being able to also put in the particularly subheadings as well. And that, to be honest, rightly use figures and tables. Today in our discussion, we looked at a paper that had 10 tables, and we decided that we probably didn't need all of those tables. So it's this idea about why are we using, what does a table, and don't let a table or a figure stand alone, that you should be actually referencing and walking your reader through it. So just having them. So just kind of tips for kind of thinking about when you think about a mixed method study publication plan. One of the things that we talk a lot about is, should I do separate publications for different pieces of my mixed method study? And I actually say it's more about who the audience is and who would be interested and what are the implications of your different parts. So I see there's kind of 4 possible publication types, probably more. But you see the empirical qualitative only, the empirical quantitative only in some studies, in empirical mixed methods. So that's your meta inferences. And then don't forget that there is often a methodological contribution to be used in that. And so that, and often I think you can do a theoretical methodological contribution, or you can do a more empirical. And so which simply means that you're talking about the contribution as well as talking about some of the empirical findings at the same time. I have no doubt that you're familiar with Jane, but there's also a new EndNote manuscript matcher, which I think has kind of improved it recently. And if we can, let's finish with just talking about, about how do you decide what order to publish things in. And I think sometimes you have to think about, what are the ones you can get out quickly or are already within maybe your comfort zone. So I think a lot about your skill set and expertise. It often takes me longer to, prepare a publication in journals that I'm less familiar with, because that makes sense. The type of mixed method design, if you're doing a convergent, maybe your qualitative is ready to go before your quantitative. Maybe that just makes sense. The availability, I mean, this is always, one of those things when you're co-authoring with folks. The timing of conferences, sometimes folks find conferences a really helpful, date to deadline to kind of have something ready for. And some conferences require short papers or longer papers. You want to think about the timing. Like if you're on a cutting edge of something, maybe it's important to get that inference out to your field so it can be discussed before somebody else does. And then also thinking about publication timelines. I know, as an editor, we can sometimes have, a year where things are in press, and that can be hard. So maybe you need publications for a particular thing, award, employment. There's a practical reason why you want to have things listed and available for others to kind of look at. So that's kind of where we were going to kind of finish up with. And I really do think health researchers, you are ahead of the curve in many ways. And I think part of it is the way that you work in your practice, is that you're already thinking almost, mixed. You come at this naturally, where you've often, been used to taking different types of data and bringing it together, and watching and observing and not just taking maybe perhaps what people are telling you directly, but also, seeing them with a lens and looking at the whole systems or the whole, as well, people, if you're looking, or populations or participants. So I really do think that there's a real contribution to be made by health professions to mixed methods. You can see that we're not quite there yet in terms of, even in kind of the methodological field, that we need folks to be doing mixed methods in lots of different contexts for us to understand maybe and develop those common guidelines for as we go forward.
Any questions? Anything? Oh, Jonathan, go ahead, and then Sandra, and then we'll do that.
Somewhere in the kind of the criteria for good presentation of MMR, you talked, or maybe I didn't hear as explicitly, or we didn't walk through an example. It was basically conceptual framework.
Yes.
Could you give us a little bit of understanding there, specifically as how you want to handle theories, which sometimes will be at odds with each other? And certainly you're going to, when you get to the analysis phase, realize, oh, my findings are actually showing that this new theory actually is a better fit or is complementary to some of the theory I started with. And how do you capture that, how you move, how do you reconcile that differences, and how do you keep the complexity and the messiness there when you're trying to, because typically we write for clarity and for a narrative that kind of makes sense without any kind of hiccups. And what I'm hearing with all of this is we want to show the complexity, which is what really MMR is well situated for.
Well, I hope so. So I hope we actually see mixed methods as a vehicle for having the conversations, because mixed methods in itself is messy in many ways. I mean, I think all of our approaches are messy to a certain extent. So if I hear you saying, I think we have an opportunity in mixed methods to develop practices that then may actually be adopted in other approaches, in the same way that I think we are influenced by the experiences people have in what they bring. I think it's part of the beauty of of when you have different disciplines and different methodological expertise working in it. And so we've tended to have more conversations and more expectations in probably the qualitative world around doing that and around building a conceptual framework and making that explicit. Where in quantitative, we've often relied on, we don't always defend our decisions around instruments as explicitly or variables that we're looking at. And so I almost challenge us to do this more. And so one of the ways that I see that is if you can build a conceptual framework, and I think a visual would be a nice way of making that explicit. And I mean, I think you can be upfront about both where it's complementary and maybe where they're at odds a little bit in this. And those discussions, it's probably easier to talk about it within a particular example. Do you have an example in mind?
Yeah, nothing that jumps.
And that is a question about how we actually talk about theory and mixed methods, or about what we talked a lot about today is actually how things and our thinking and our evolve over a study. So how do you always come back and almost account for those changes? Would that make sense as well?
Yeah, your conceptual framework, you want to say, here's the rationale for our argument.
Yeah.
And usually you choose a theory that says, I'm going to limit the scope of my perspective via this theory. It is going to set the boundaries and the guardrails, and here's how I'm going to approach it. It seems to me that you can take, because particularly if you're doing a concurrent type of study, where you're saying, I'm going to capture data here and here, there might be two theories that are actually speaking to the problem, but from different sides, and that you can combine into your conceptual framework. And that just, like, when I just try to think about how to get the discussion to roll at that point, I'm like, wow, I feel like I'm arguing for and arguing at an orthogonal way to what I'm trying to show. That's it, having not done it, that I'm just looking for that.
And tell me if I'm still following this or not, but I recently published an article that actually shows how the ways that we see a complex phenomenon change over the course of our study. And I think part of that is that we were trying to make explicit that this is natural to happen. And I wonder if that could happen with your conceptual framework as well. Wouldn't that be interesting to talk about, maybe even at the front of the paper, like here's where, the conceptualization and here's where we went to. And then you're actually, being upfront about how it changed and you're almost accounting for why the data plan evolved over time. I mean, I wonder if there's a way of front-ending that, as opposed to do we have to tell the story in the chronological order in which it happened, or can we, be upfront about, and maybe that's the language that, maybe there's a category of that is that I used evolving, because we do have examples where people have gone from doing a concurrent study to a sequential study. And they talk about, because we didn't get enough, recruitment at that time. And so we changed up what we were doing and that, but that's a rare. I mean, we often talk about it as almost like the way that we wish our study had happened, or that we had thought about the study in this way in the beginning, when really it happened over time. So why couldn't we do that with our conceptual framework? Why couldn't that be a mechanism for almost framing that?
I'm not speaking against it.
But I haven't seen it yet, which is exciting.
I guess it's just easier to have clear, simple narrative. The world's perfect, and I've never had any hiccups.
But there is.
Which is what we all hide behind in our other textures.
But maybe this is a larger conversation. Will this be 1 minute, I swear?
Sounds good.
But I think this is a larger, that if we want to do cutting edge research in areas that there are no known established ways of doing this, or even what people to bring in, or then we've got to be willing to do things a little bit differently and see studies written up a little bit differently if we want to encourage more of this. Otherwise, people are going to default to what they know they can do and how they can do it. And I think we're going to miss out on some opportunities. So maybe that's a nice way to finish.
Yeah, it's a great way to
kind of complete
their remarks, right?
Thinking bigger.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Poth, again for speaking, and thank you everyone for attending, and have a great night. Thank you.